Here we are, the Portland Children's Levy Allocation Committee meeting, and the date today is the 3rd of February. I'm Ted Wheeler. I am the Allocation Committee Chair. I'd also like to introduce the other committee members. On my left is Multnomah County Commissioner Jessica Vega-Peters. It's great to see you. And next to her, of course, is Felicia Tripp-Folsom, who is our county appointed member. It's good to see you again. And on the far right over here is Mitch Honecker. He is our business community representative. And it is with great pleasure that I would also like to introduce our newly appointed, city-appointed allocation committee member, Tracy Rossi. Tracy, we welcome you. And Tracy comes as the executive director for the Center for Women's Leadership. She has a long and successful career working in higher education, nonprofit organizations, and youth development, focusing on service to women and, of course, emerging student leaders as well. And we thank you for that. We welcome you. We're delighted to have you on the board, especially over the course of the next few months. As we all know, are going to be very, very busy months for the allocation committee, and I'm sure everybody in this room. And Tracy, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm going to anyway. I don't know if you wanted just to say a few words.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to serve and be a part of this process. As a longtime Oregonian, it feels nice to be able to give and contribute to the community in this way. And so I look forward to working with all of my colleagues here.
Great. Well, it'll be quite the adventure, and we're appreciative of your willingness to serve.
Yes.
And of course, next up, we have a hello from the entire Portland Children's Levy staff. We have Lisa Pellegrino, Meg McElroy, Lisa Hansel, Mary Gay Broderick, John Coughlin, John Kelly, and a special introduction to the Levy's new small grants fund manager, Erica Bridgman-Bagnoli. Can you stand up so we can all see you? We're so excited to have you here. Thank you. And I believe we're going to hear from you later, so we'll look forward to that. All right, so starting with the most boring thing imaginable, can we approve the minutes from the November 4th meeting?
So moved.
We have a motion.
Second.
We have a second. Any objection? Mitch, any questions? Okay, it's approved without objection. That gets us to public comment on non-agenda items. There will be opportunities to comment on things that are actually on the agenda later, but does anybody want to just make a comment not related to anything on today's agenda? How predictable. Have we ever had anybody? Yeah, I know. I feel like we should probably almost instigate it. No, it just, you don't know, in my usual gig here, people fly to the microphone, and I always, I'm all for democracy and public input, but there are days when honestly I regret it somewhat. Okay, our first main item of business is the revised levy revenue forecast. Fiscal Specialist John Kelly will walk us through these projections, and if there's time, and there is time for committee questions and public comment before we'll be asked to vote. And Lisa is joining him, of course. I don't know who wants to start us off. Lisa?
I'm going to start off because I'm going to remind you of what you decided last time. And it's been several months, and also Tracy was not with us, and so I thought it would benefit everybody just to remember where we are and how we got here. So just to remind folks of the rules that govern the allocation of the overall funds, we do have a 5% administrative cap, so all staffing is charged to that. The rules also require that 90% of available funds be granted out through competitive processes, and up to 10% can be available funds can be allocated in a non-competitive process for three purposes: special initiatives that address multiple program areas, quality improvement and training and technical assistance for grantees, and then improving systems that affect children and organizations that serve them. So in the fall meetings, you all allocated, there was projected revenues of $81.1 million over the 3 years, the next 3 fiscal years, $72 million in projected tax revenues, and $9.12 million in fund balance. Okay, so that was the resources that you were working with. A total of a little over $70 million was allocated for competitive grants, with $1 million set aside for the small grants fund in that time period, and the remainder of the funds to be let through the competitive process, which is happening right now. The non-competitive grants, you all allocated 7.1 million total to that category. 5.1 was to renew the Community Child Care Initiative, which you all chose to do last time, and City Council has now approved that grant. And then setting aside $1 million for training in TA and quality improvement. And then $1 million was left unallocated, potentially to be used for system improvement grants. John will tell you what has happened in the interim with projected revenues and how staff proposes to deal with that.
So last month, in January, we received new revenue projections for the next 3 fiscal years from the city economist, Josh Harwood. He gives us revenue projections every year, going out 6-7 years. This year, the revenue projections show us receiving $2.2 million fewer dollars than previously projected over the next 3 years. So over 3 years, $2.2 million less than we anticipated when we set up the funding round and the RFI. So the reason for this, Josh tells me, is a new calculation of compression. Other ballot measures, other taxing districts compress how much money we actually bring in. We don't get the full amount on every property. So given the reduced revenue projections, we came up with new recommendations for how to use the funds, given that the pot was a bit smaller. So first of all, we are recommending no changes to the allocation of $1 million for the Small Grants Fund over the next 3 years. So that money we want to keep where it is, or we recommend that. We do think we would like to reduce by $1 million the allocation to the non-competitive grants for the next 3 fiscal years. So originally we had $7.1 million set aside for that. We're suggesting now $6.1 million. So after those reductions, that pot of funds will look like $5.1 million for the Child Care Initiative, which Lisa mentioned that's already approved and the contract is being created. And then $1 million for quality improvement, training and technical assistance support for grantees. So various projects where we do quality improvement, training, technical assistance to grantee organizations. So the other recommendation is to reduce the allocation to the competitive grant funding round currently underway by $1.2 million. Oh, over the next 3 years. We have slides. We forgot about those.
And you can go through.
So that's what I've just talked about. And so what the total pot of funds, we had previously recommended the number in the second column there. So you can see the first column is the percentage allocations. We've got the program areas on the far left. The original allocation was at $69,350,000. So we're recommending dropping that by, so I'm on the bottom line. The bottom line is 69,355. We're recommending dropping that to 68,150 over 3 years. What we chose to do is to use the same allocation percentages, so that the percentage column that we calculated from the original allocations, we applied to the new pot of funds, and that gives us the proposed revised allocations in the fourth column there. And you can see how much each area dropped in the same percentage. So the dollar amounts are obviously different, but we're recommending, so for example, early childhood was 30.7% of the total. We keep it 30.7% of the total, but it drops from 21,297 to 29,28 roughly. So clear questions? And then we do need to ask for your decision on this. This is our recommendation, all the pieces that we mentioned.
So it's just a prorated, just.
Exactly,
reduction
yes,
is what you're-
prorated.
And just to be clear, these numbers are for over a 3-year period.
Yes, because
Okay,
we are
got
about
it.
to let the money for 3 years beginning next fiscal year, beginning July 1, 2020 through June 30,
2023.
23.
All right, good. Any objections?
Is there any questions? I just want to make sure it's clear.
It seems like the reasonable way to go about it.
All right.
Commissioner.
Do you want to take any public testimony? I don't know if anybody wants to
Anybody
testify.
want to testify? Come on up. What's that?
Do I have to come up here?
Yeah, please, because people listen on the mic, over
So
TV and they can't hear.
It's more of a couple questions, so that I understand compression. Like, is there no advocacy or potential, given the mandate of what the Children's Levy does, can we push back on that? Or is it just non-negotiable?
Oh, compression.
The joys there.
I mean, I'm
Do you
asking
wanna
the
take
mayor.
it? The answer is no. I wish the answer was yes, but no, it's a structural problem with the way our our property tax system works given ballot measures that were passed by the public statewide. Measures 5, 47, and 50, particularly 5, creates compression.
Okay, so the next question was, if I remember the last time Mitch had made a suggestion about increasing a certain allocation, was it for foster care or for another? Was there any consideration around, because at that last meeting, we thought, oh, we're good with money, so if we have extra, we would do that. Given that we now know that we're having 2.2, and for somebody who is in the direct service, our population is growing, not shrinking, so the same dollars means less dollars. And so there's going to be some reality checks going. But, and I don't want to be presumptuous or difficult, but was there any consideration around that change?
We did make that change at the last meeting. Yeah, so of the full pot, he wanted to move money out of, so staff had recommended a larger pie for the
Right.
non-competitive.
Right.
And he suggested moving 650
That's
out
right.
of that. And we did do that at that meeting. That's what the committee voted on. So the totals that I gave you here today included that move of money out of the unallocated dollars. In other words, the pie it was already shifted. The dollars were shifted and we just applied the same percentages.
Right.
So the percentage,
Okay, so
you see what I'm saying?
is there a way to unshift it? Or what was the thinking, so that 650 could go back into the general pool?
We did not, we assumed that they wanted to keep the same percentages because that's what they voted on last time. So that's why we suggested that. You can ask them.
So
We already shifted the percentages, and so what John has proposed in terms of effectively reallocating a smaller pie is that we just simply take a prorated reduction across the
I see
categories.
that.
But we already
Right.
had the discussion about
Right.
the relative size
Right.
of the categories.
Okay.
So
I mean,
unless
my feeling
somebody
is
wants
if
to
we knew
change
that
their
it was
mind.
smaller, would we have voted that way? Maybe we would have kept the allocation as it was, given the lower numbers, but.
I'll speak for myself. It wouldn't have impacted my decision,
Okay.
given that it's a
Great.
prorata reduction.
That's my only question. Thank you.
I mean, it's a fair question. Thank you for asking it. All right. Any objection to the proposed allocation, given the new forecast? Without objection.
Okay.
So, thank you for that. Thank you again for keeping everything under the 5% administrative cap. That's been an important bellwether of this levy since the get-go, and it was something that Dan Saltzman felt very, very strongly about. And if he were sitting here, he would thank you for keeping us under that 5% administrative cap.
Thank you.
Next,
John takes responsibility
oh,
for
it's
that.
Lisa. It's Lisa.
I'll
The
stay
new
here.
allocation committee bylaws.
Yes,
Make
so-
this as scintillating as possible.
I was going to say, I hate to take this detour into legalese, and I can see the eyes will begin to shut, and I'll have to offer you coffee or something, but I do feel that coming up on funding round, we have to review these things because there are some changes.
Sure.
At least for Tracy, you didn't know the old set, so this will all just be what you'll be your operating plan for going forward. So the Office of Community and Civic Life here at the city has put into effect a standard bylaws template that all city advisory committees that advise city council must use. And so in complying with that rule, we had to redo our bylaws. So the last time they had been done was 2010, so it's been a while since they'd been changed. Most provisions in the bylaws are very similar. There's very little change, but there's a few things to go over. I just want to make sure that I highlight those and that we're all clear on them before we go forward into the funding round, because some of them will come up then. The first is that the bylaws include term limits now, no more than 8 years. So that's the limit, should you choose to accept that. The second is communications. There are specific provisions in the bylaws now that require committee members who communicate with interest groups in some way, shape, or form, or the media, or I should say, and the media, that you need to copy staff on those communications, and they have to be part of the public record, and they can be requested as part of a public record. So if you are communicating with interest groups about the business of the allocation committee, which I'll take you back just a second, you all voted that you would not do that in this funding round, so you shouldn't have anything to communicate to me about what's going on in the funding round. But if you were to have any communication in the future, after the funding round is over, that those need to be CC'd to staff. And we also are not, this is just a reiteration, we are not allowed to deliberate toward decision via email, so that's explicitly stated in the bylaws now. We have to do deliberations in public meetings. So the last section, which is most relevant to the funding round, is around conflicts of interest. The new bylaws specifically state that you all are public officials, since you are on a committee that advises City Council on funding recommendations, and that you all are required under those rules, under the city, or rather the state ethics laws, to disclose any conflicts at each meeting at which the conflict is being, the issue giving rise to the conflict is being discussed or being voted upon or being debated. Staff has to keep a record of all conflicts of interest, and we also have to include them in the recommendations for funding to City Council, which is something we've done in the past, but we will continue doing that. State law defines actual conflicts of interest, and this is where you'll have to bear with me on the legalese, as any action or decision or recommendation by a person acting in a capacity as a public official, which is you all, the effect of which would be to the private pecuniary benefit or detriment of the person or the person's relative or any business with which the person or relative is associated. Businesses include nonprofit corporations, but the law specifically exempts officials holding non-compensated positions on other nonprofit boards. And since I know some of you sit on other nonprofit boards, I wanted to make sure that we get clear about this. Our previous bylaws for the allocation committee specifically required that allocation committee members not vote or debate or give any comment on any allocations to organizations where they sit on the board. However, that is exempted from the conflict of interest law under state law. So I wanted to, staff wanted to kind of come forward and recommend that you all continue with the higher standard, even though it isn't required by the law, since that has been our practice, and because I know that some folks do sit on boards where it might be an issue, potentially. So that's kind of an overall review of the changes and what our recommendation would be going forward. So I'd like your thoughts and whether or not you all agree with that. Any questions about it?
I have a question about the term limits. So 8 consecutive years, that does not preclude, just to be clear, that does not preclude somebody from serving 8 years and then taking time away and then potentially being reappointed?
Yes.
For 8 years, is that correct?
That's correct. But you have to wait 2 years, the length of a term.
Okay, thank you.
You have to wait the 2 years, and then you could serve another 8,
Okay,
should you
thank you.
desire to do that.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
I'm sure you can't wait for that, Mayor.
No, when I retire, I will actually enjoy retirement.
Yes, I imagine so. Any other questions about these rules and how they affect you all? Oh, okay. Is everybody okay with continuing to state conflicts regarding boards? Any objection to that? Okay, great.
Nope.
All right,
Not seeing it.
that is all I have for you.
All right, thank you, Lisa, appreciate it. Erica's up next. Welcome, Erica. She's going to give us some background on the small grant fund, which we're excited to hear about, along with details on how it's shaping up so far.
Do we have to approve these?
Well, that's a good question. Lisa, did you want us to make a formal approval of the changes to the bylaws, or?
Well, it's not-
Can
it's
I
not-
add a clarification there too? We were also wondering whether you needed a formal vote on the allocation revision.
Do you want us to take one?
I think it probably can't hurt.
Okay. I'll
Okay.
take a motion on the allocation revision.
So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any opposition? Without objection. Did we need to do anything on the
The
bylaws?
bylaws are there, they're in effect right now, they're
Already.
not a matter for voting. I wanted to check
Clarify.
with you all for the coming meetings and for when we have the allocation committee meetings, we're all agreed to state those conflicts.
Great, cool.
Ready?
Hi, Erica.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor, Commissioner, and Allocation Committee members. I'm really excited to be here today in my new role and to talk about our upcoming plans for the Small Grants Fund. So the purpose of the Small Grants Fund is to increase equity. The Children's Levy has heard through multiple processes and sources that there are numerous barriers that small organizations face when applying for levy funds. Many of these smaller organizations don't have a full-time staff person who is an experienced grant writer. Some are attempting to apply while writing in a language that is not their first language and may even be their third or fourth language. And applications are not truly reflective of the quality of their work, which is emerging directly out of the communities most affected by inequities. So the Small Grants Fund sets up a pathway through which these small organizations with budgets of $1 million or less that they can be able to access levy funds, expand their valuable work, and increase their capacity, including eventually to be able to apply for larger grants. And that'll allow them to serve more children, youth, and families from marginalized communities here in Portland. So we are proposing to launch the Small Grants Fund through a two-step process. The first step is that applicants will be submitting letters of inquiry describing their organizations and/or their program, and then they'll be narrowed down into a smaller applicant pool that will be chosen to move forward. In a second, I'll talk more about how that narrowing can happen. In the second step, they will be invited to submit their full documentation, so organizational budgets and additional supporting materials. And one thing that we're really thinking about this is that in the interest of equity, we would like the second step not to be 100% written process. We want to have some sort of interactive way through videos or interviews or site visits, and we're still kind of exploring what that could look like so that the entire process isn't weighted just on the written word. So go ahead, move forward. So another part of thinking about how to design this process is that I've put together an ad hoc committee that I'm calling a design team to kind of help me design the process and how we can make this to be a community participatory process that gets us to the organizations that we really most want to be able to fund. So the design team is conducted of 6 members that include expertise from both public and private foundations, and their lived experience represents the communities that we are also trying to outreach. So they represent African refugee community, disabled community, Latinx, Vietnamese refugee, Native American, African American, LGBTQ, and immigrant. And most of our design team members have 2 or more of these identities at the same time, as well as experience in the Children Levy's funding areas. Okay, thank you. So the first step in the process that I'm really looking forward to and really gearing up for even as we speak are the community conversations. So I have a list of over 50 small organizations throughout the Portland area that some I inherited because there was an intern who was doing some work at the Children's Levy before I came who was researching organizations working in our funding areas. Others I've outreached to through looking at specific cultural communities that are underrepresented in the larger funds and reaching out to community health workers and community leaders from those cultural communities. And once I reached out to one small organization, that organization is like, oh, you need to know about these other 3 organizations. So they began referring to each other. So through that, we have outreach through email, through mail, and many other ways, invited them to these community conversations. And the community conversations are designed for us to be able to tell them about the Levy's small grant fund, but also to be able to get additional information on how we can make the grant-making process to be supportive and equitable. So one of the questions or the topics that we would discuss and where we would hear feedback from these small organizations themselves is what kind of technical assistance would really help them in the process. There are some things that they may be able to build into their own budgets when they start to create their grants. There are some things that we can provide, and there are some resources where I could refer them to. So just kind of wanting to know what would technical assistance needs look like for these organizations. And as I mentioned in the second step of the process, we didn't want it to be entirely in writing. We wanted to find some sort of interactive way, but we're still not entirely sure what's the best way to go about doing that. So we wanted to get feedback from the organizations and what their thoughts are. And then just anything additional that they would like to give us in terms of what a strength-based grant-making process could look like for them. So our timeline with all of this is that in the first kind of quarter of the year, January to March, we'll be having the conversations with the communities, taking this information back, looking at what we've heard, and starting to create draft application materials for the letter of inquiry, which is the first step in the process, and then get that to all of you for approval for your meeting in April. And then have the letters of inquiry come in the April to July period. Then we would like in August and September for the design team and a group of reviewers recruited from the community to look at all the applications. I'm anticipating maybe 30 or 40 come in the first round, narrow them down and make recommendations for who can move forward to the next round. Then we would have, after we have all of the materials for the next round, we present our slate of recommendations to all of you all for approval, and hopefully have the entire slate approved by City Council by the end of this year, so that we can start funding in the beginning of next year and have those funds go out to the community organizations. Along the lines, as we're moving along and we have applications approved, I am planning on having kind of brown bag lunch or small workshops where people can come and kind of learn, okay, this is what the city means by our insurance requirements or our background check requirements or other kinds of requirements that they may not be familiar with. Because one of the goals that I have is to make this as accessible to people as possible, and especially organizations that are led by people who may not have had this kind of access to government funding or this kind of democratic experience. So I really want to be able to provide venues in which people can come and ask questions and be able to get all of their materials together so we can get them through the process. So that is what I have for you, and I am open for questions.
Very good. Colleagues?
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks so much for all your work on this. It's great. Welcome aboard to the Children's Levy. And I think all of us are excited about the opportunities that the small grants program can provide to those organizations. It reminds me a little bit of the granting that the East Portland Action Plan does to some of the community-based organizations, especially those from populations that aren't familiar with how this process goes. So I appreciate the thoughtfulness and the really intentionality that you've done of looking at all the different ways, from not relying so much on written to making sure people have a basic understanding of definitions that really makes this a process that people can be successful with. So thank you so much for this, and I look forward to going through this whole thing for the next year.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Is there any public testimony on this item? All right, thanks, Erica. We look forward to hearing a lot more from you, obviously, in the coming months. And next, Meg is going to present the annual data presentation, which includes status report on children with families served in the 2018-2019 cycle, as well as comparisons from previous years. Good afternoon, Meg.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor. And I had to chuckle earlier when you said something about accomplishing the most boring part of the meeting, because I thought, well, that's a relief. That won't be my part of the meeting then.
Excuse me, I did not call it the most boring part of the meeting.
All right.
I may have referred to it, as the most fun, challenged portion of the meeting, but I'm sure I didn't use the word boring.
Well, I'll try to make this at least fun. So first, I just want to say before we get started that the data that I will discuss comes from all of the programs that are funded by the levy. So there are a lot of people in this room and their colleagues and partners across the city who track a lot of information that we require and give it to us, and we put it all together to put together the near 40-page report that you all have and this handful of slides that I will walk you through. So a big thank you to all of them for their hard work. So as I said, there's a full report that goes over sort of the general expectations, results, and implications related to our investment goals, the overall goals of the levy, and our various performance metrics. And what I'll talk about today is a very high-level summary looking pretty exclusively at just the levy-wide highlights. There are program area-specific details in the larger report. Each program area gets about a 3 to 4 page deeper look for those of you who are interested in that. So just a reminder, when the levy was passed for the 2014 to 2019 levy period, it included 3 goals. Those same goals remain for the new levy. They are to prepare children for school, to support children's success inside of school. And as currently written, the goal says to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in children's well-being and success. During our community engagement process, our contractor pushed back and said, well, don't you want to eliminate those disparities? And we said, yes. Unfortunately, these are the way this goal was worded in our ballot measure, but in the spirit of honoring her good feedback, I think we should think about, in the future, setting our goal as eliminating racial and ethnic disparities. So with that in mind, in 2014-19, there were 2 investment goals set by this body when it began its grant making in 2014. One was to invest at least 30% of the funds in culturally specific services levy-wide, as well as in each program area, and to increase access to services in East Portland. And so we were looking at how do our metrics tell us we did that in this 5-year period, and we looked at it each year compared to the previous 5-year period, and compared to that 30% goal. So just some additional context. In 18-19, a total of $18.9 million in grants were invested. That is an increase of $11 million from 14-15. So our pie increased over time. And in the 14 to 19 period, nearly 35% of funds were invested in culturally specific organizations and programs, and that is compared to 31% in the previous levy. So we exceeded that 30% goal and improved it from the 09 to 13 period, as well as the pie went up, the amount of money we invested total. So as that percent went up, more money went into those services. Unfortunately, we did not meet that goal in 2 of our program areas, both hunger relief and child abuse prevention intervention, in part because it depends on what kinds of applicants applied for funding in those program areas. In hunger relief, for example, there were, I think, very few to none applications from culturally specific programs. And then in child abuse prevention intervention, 27% of resources in that program area were invested in those programs. So it's just shy of that 30% goal. For services increasing access in East Portland, in the previous 5-year levy period, that 09 to 13, we were at 38% of children served resided or attended school in East Portland, and that is up to 44% for this levy period. So we did increase access. So the next thing we try to understand is who is participating in the services funded by the Children's Levy. So we want to try to understand equity of access given our goals. For specifically in this last year, 2018-19, now we're looking because we try to understand these numbers each year. Each grantee sets a goal for how many children or parents they'll serve, and they exceeded those goals by 14%. In addition, we ask each program funded to tell us the total number of children served. So even if their primary client, for example, is a family, like that's who they track their outcome goals on, or those are how they set their numbers for who they're going to serve, we also ask them to tell us the total number of children that are part of those families, as well as demographic information about them. So for those 12,000 children, the majority of them were from homes with an annual income of 185% of the federal poverty level or less. Just for context, that's about $46,000 a year for a family of 4. The median income in Portland is $81,000 for a family of 4. About 30% of the children served were from homes with a primary language other than English. So when you look further underneath that, about 20% are from homes where the primary language is Spanish, and the other 10% are from homes that speak about one of 50 other languages that are reported by grantees. Nearly 70% of the children served identified as a child of color, and in 1819, 42% resided in or attended school in East Portland. Just for additional context, these numbers are pretty similar as they have been for the past couple of years, so there haven't been dramatic changes in 1819 compared to past years. So in this slide, one thing we try to understand is how well do programs funded by the Levy reach the diversity of our child population. So to try to understand that, we look at the demographics of the children served by Levy-funded programs compared to the school-age population in our community. So what this graph is showing us in the top bar is the race, ethnicity, identity data for the children served by the Levy in 1819 compared to the racial and ethnic identity of students enrolled in Portland area schools in the same annual period. When I say Portland area schools, I'm not just talking about Portland public schools, I'm also talking about David Douglas, Centennial, Park Rose, and part of Reynolds. So what this graph tells us is that the Levy-funded program served a racially and ethnically more diverse population than is served in our area public schools. And one thing we want to be sure of at a minimum is that the figures are proportional, that we are at least reaching the population proportional to their makeup of the child population. But given our goals, what's really more important is that we're reaching proportionally more children of certain populations who are experiencing racial and ethnic disparities in their outcomes than they comprise in the population. So for example, this top bar shows that among children served by the Levy in 1819, 17.5% identified as African American. When we look at enrollment data for Portland's area schools, 9.4% of children identify as African American or African because the school's data groups those two populations together. Our data breaks it out. So the Levy data, 3.7% of children identified as African immigrants. So you can try to kind of see the differences in sort of who we're reaching compared to the child population in our schools. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Feel free to ask questions as we go or save them for the end. I'm happy to do whatever works best. The next thing that we look at is not just who came into the programs that are funded, but how well they engaged and sustained participation over time. So again, we want to see these figures look similar. We don't want to see big gaps between the population that came in and the population that remained over time. So about nearly 80% of participants stay in the program long enough to have outcome goals tracked and measured about them. About 6% leave early before that can happen. And again, we're trying to understand for those participants who stuck around to meet participation goals and have outcomes tracked, what does the racial and ethnic diversity of that population look like compared to the people who came into services? So what these two graphs are showing you is that those populations are pretty similar. So who comes in and enrolls in services, programs are doing a great job of sustaining their participation over time. There are some slight differences or disparities, but they're typically less than 1 percentage point between populations. So since we know that I'm going to go backwards for a minute. Since we know that the population of who enters Levy-funded programs and stays over time is a pretty racially and ethnically diverse population. When we start to look at outcomes, which we don't have disaggregated by race and ethnicity, we kind of make the assumption that the outcomes that we're talking about are about that population that we've already told you has sustained participation over time. It would take a lot of work for our programs to do further disaggregation of outcome data, so I don't have that kind of information to show you, but I will walk you through what we do have. Each program sets a number of goals of outcomes that they track annually with the children and families that they serve. So one program might have 3 goals, one program might have 8 goals. Of the total goals that they set, 82% of them were met. How they set goals varies by the type of program model that's funded, the intensity of the services they're offered, and the population that they serve. To the extent that there are programs doing similar work and tracking similar outcomes, we will look at that on the next slide, but I just want to remind people that not every program in the levy is tracking the same types of outcomes because they're not all doing the same thing. So we'll get into some numbers that sort of might look small to you, but it's just important to remember we can only talk about similar things across programs that track similar outcomes. So in early childhood, for example, close to 90% of the children served met expected developmental milestones. That's in keeping with what we would expect because the prevalence of delay in disability, according to CDC data, is around 13% in this population. So we see that our programs are reaching children and families early and helping get them connected to other services and staying on track with what we would expect to see in this population. I'm not going to state everything that's on this slide, but I want to just let you know that underneath the outcome is the number of programs that track this outcome that I'm talking about out of the total in that program area. So for example, we fund 16 programs in early childhood, 12 of them track this particular outcome. And then the next piece of information there tells you the total number of children for which this data were reported and the total number that met the outcome. So in child abuse prevention intervention, close to over 90% of parents met their parenting outcomes. In foster care, close to 95% of children and youth met the academic outcomes that were tracked by their program. In after school, 86% of children and youth met youth development outcomes, and in mentoring, 96% of youth met their school engagement outcomes. We also look at staff turnover in all of our programs because it has an impact on the relationships that programs have with the clients that they serve, has an impact on how well youth and families stay engaged and sustained participation over time, and it can affect outcomes as well. And what we have seen over the years is that about 15 to 20% of staff turnover annually, and an average of 16.9% turned over during 18-19. That rate varies differently by different program areas, so there's more information in that report. And one thing that our data lack is reasons for turnover. I can't tell you whether the turnover was because somebody received a promotion or pursued a higher degree or happened to retire. But I can tell you that our data of turnover mirrors sector trends across all of our program area sectors. All right. I should have said this earlier. The data in the slides I just reviewed looked at 5 out of our 6 program areas and did not talk about hunger relief because the hunger relief services don't track sustained participation over time. They don't look at changes in people's attitudes, behavior, and knowledge as outcome. They're more about getting emergency food to children and families. So the next few slides are going to look exclusively at our hunger relief program area. Over 11,000 children and close to 3,000 parents were served in that area. School food pantries comprise the biggest sort of source of emergency food. 55% of the total served there accessed resources through school food pantries, and then other emergency food resources served the remaining children and families. Those include home-delivered meals, the summer school lunch program, produce and prepared food donations from partner organizations, and food from community gardens. About 53% of the children served live in the hunger relief programs, live or attend school in East Portland. And these programs served proportionally more Latinx and Asian children and proportionally fewer African American children than were enrolled in Portland area schools. So there is some need for increased attention to access for the African American population in this program area. However, we're also missing data from about 30% of those served in this program area. It wasn't reported, so there's some caution to how we interpret those race ethnicity data in this program area. In terms of highlights, 2 grantees provided emergency food at 9 Sun School sites where there were no pantries in 18-19. There has been an increase over the past 3 years in families using the pantries 6 times a year. So when we look back at 16-17, 39% of families were using it 6 times a year. That's up to 53% in 18-19. In addition, home-delivered meals increased 12% from last year, and a major source of referrals is through the Women, Infant, Children federally funded nutrition program. In addition, there's been great demand for the free fruits for subsidized produce and Whole Foods program at Village Market that offers free fruits and discounts on produce and Whole Foods, and a customer loyalty program, which keeps 491 people and 456 households at New Columbia were using that program at Village Market. So in thinking of implications of these data and looking ahead, just a couple things to keep in mind as we enter this upcoming funding round. There are things that have been going well with service access equity. So for example, the current programs funded by the Levy are reaching priority populations, particularly proportionally higher than school enrollment. So the Levy is doing a good job reaching the African American and African immigrant population, for example, with its current constellation of programs. And we want to make sure we don't go backward from that as we fund new grants. We want to try to keep in mind the service access question. But when we look at some of the other populations, for example, we are not reaching the Asian immigrant population, the Native American population, and the Pacific Islander population proportional to their enrollment in the school population. So those are some things we'll have to keep in mind as new funding decisions are made. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mayor. So, and I would just say, as a takeoff on this slide, it looked like for the Latinx population, we were really only reaching people at where they appeared in the school population.
Yeah, I am so glad you asked that, Jessica, or pointed that out, because it's actually, it's hard to know. It's a little bit of a data issue. So the way, this is going to get deep in the technical weeds, but bear with me. The way that we, the Levy, ask grantees to report data to us is that, so in this slide, the top bar, any child who identifies only as Latinx is counted in that 22.5%. If a child identifies as Latinx and some other background, that is counted in multiracial. ODE's data is done differently. They count any child who identifies as Latinx and anything else as Latinx. Their multiracial data is only children who identify as multiracial, excluding Latinx. So it's hard for us to interpret the relationship between how well we're reaching proportionally that population. So for example, like our multiracial population, we do get data from programs about, for the individuals they serve who identify as multiracial, what are all the identities that that person has, and that's in the report. And it shows you how much the Latinx, the Native American, and the Pacific Islander population are actually more represented in our data than how this shows when we ask for that disaggregated multiracial data. But it's not an even comparison such that we can tell how well we did or didn't reach the population compared to their composition in the school population. So it's a good question.
Yeah. No, and I get there's complications with the data. I also think that it's really important, though, that we try to figure out how we're serving people, especially some of these challenging populations, like the Latinx community, which does identify as multiracial all the times, because ethnicity and race are two different things, right? So there's a lot of ambiguity there sometimes in data, but we still need to figure it out, like how we are. So it sounds like we're challenged with that right now, but that might be interesting too.
I mean, I would definitely say, to your earlier point, as we think about service access and funding, we wouldn't want to go backward from these numbers, absolutely, and forward is better. Yeah, thanks.
I did have a question. Thanks
Yes.
for your report. I saw in a couple areas that about just over half of the children lived in East County, and I wondered if there was any other trends in terms of where the other 48, 49%
Oh,
were?
it's a good question. I believe it's in our report. I don't know off the top of my head. I would say typically 12% are in North Portland. I think 2.5% indicated that they are homeless, and then the others are about town.
better.
And we ask grantees to report that data by zip code, so I could give you a more detailed breakdown by zip code if you want it.
Okay, I was just curious. It sounds like there's kind of scattered around.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Very good. Is there any public testimony on this item?
I would just say it's not testimony, but anecdotally.
Yeah, sure, come on up. Can you come up to the microphone,
I
because
would
this
just say
is
anecdotally,
recorded?
we serve the Latinx community, and we've seen a significant reduction over the past 2 years and attributable sort of national policy and being afraid to fill out forms and being afraid to show services. So, I mean, I think it's a bigger problem than data. It's just a reality of
That's a great
an
point.
underserved problem.
It's a great point.
We've definitely seen that too.
All right, well, Meg, thank you for that. And I know there's a lot of number crunching and data analysis that goes into providing the information that you provided us with today. Thank you for that. And I also want to give a shout out to all of our providers for also providing the data that Meg and her team then use to be able to provide the annual data report. So thank you for that. That concludes the agenda, correct, for our meeting today. So I want to thank everybody for that and their work during what is a very busy pre-grant making time. There's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes, and I want to thank you for that. As always, you can stay posted on all the information related to the levy on the website, other outreach communications. Colleagues, unless there's anything else, we stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.